We covered the middle portion of chapter 5, where Jesus talked about some of the Old Testament laws about murder, adultery, and oaths. And how were the Pharisees approaching these laws? They were trying really hard to define the letter of the law instead of understanding the heart of the law, okay? And yes, I'm drawing on my laptop again, so this is, original artwork, right? It's awesome. So when Christians, they say things like, well, if it's not forbidden in the Bible, then I can do it. The thing is, we end up being just like the Pharisees in that we're focusing on the letter of the law. Okay, so with that in the background, we're going to study what Jesus says next. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. Okay, so this section, should we try to apply it right now? No. Okay, so this section deals with the topic of retaliation against wrongs. Where does it come from? It comes from the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 19. It shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Okay, so verse 38, eye for eye. Now, of course, this isn't it's not supposed to be done literally. It's a graphic metaphor to show the main idea of what? Of equivalent and measured punishment. So to give you some context, in ancient times, when wrongs are done against you, like what can you do? What are your options? Got punched in the face, right? In the eye. There are laws, but the justice system, right? Law enforcement, it's kind of spotty and sometimes really difficult to come by. And that's true even to this day in most countries. So when you experience wrong, what are your options to get some justice? So here's some options, right? But one option that was very viable was personal vendetta, that last one. Get revenge. And this is the stuff of kung fu movies, right? Like I think of Kung Fu Panda, Ip Man, one of my favorite. Kung Fu Panda, okay? So what is the plot? You killed my teacher, so then you train hard against the person who and then you go after him and you get justice. So that's how it's done. If you mess with my family, then I will mess with your family. So this threat of retaliation, it often becomes a check against evil in ancient times. But here's the thing, revenge is often more. Our retaliation to evil being done to us is way beyond mere justice. Our retaliation, it demands a much harsher response than the original evil committed. And this is just a typical theme in action movies. Like the bad guy, right? Kills your wife, leaves you half dead. So then what does the good guy do? The good guy goes to the bad guy's headquarters, and there's all these bodyguards protecting him. So the good guy, he takes out all 20 bodyguards. They're surrounding the mansion, but they're just like doing their job, right? And then he takes out the bad guy's entire extended family, blows up the house, the entire compound, makes sure the bad guy sees all of it so that he is psychologically punished, and then the good guy kills him, but not quickly, but kind of in a torturous way, making sure he feels the pain. So we look at something like that, and we're not like, oh my gosh, it's way too much. The bad guy just killed 2 people, and you're killing 100 people. We don't go like, oh, wait a minute, like you're the good. No, we don't say that. We're like, we think that's okay. Something in us is like, yeah, that's right. What does that show us? I think that shows us that our propensity for retaliation is not eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. No, our desire is if you take 1 eye, I'm going to take 2 eyes. Maybe your nose too. If you take 1 tooth, I'm going to take out your whole mouth. It's that. Like, can you imagine an action movie where this principle of eye for an eye was enacted and bad guy takes 1 tooth? So then the good guy goes up to the bad guy, takes 1 tooth. End the movie. Like, it would be so dissatisfying, right? It wouldn't work. So this principle, okay, that the Israelites, that God gave the Israelites, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. This is actually a concession that puts a limit on our revenge because our desire for vengeance is way overboard. It was a way to pump the brake on the downward spiral because you know how it goes. Vengeance begets vengeance, and each time it gets amplified, it gets worse and worse. Recently I was playing a card game with my kids, Dungeon Mayhem, and where you play different characters trying to kill the others. It's just a card game, okay? So, and you're basically waiting for everyone else to get weaker so that you're all around the same level so that you as the final person can somehow kill the other two before they kill you. So then Isaac kills Jeremiah, and Jeremiah's like, well, now you're in trouble because Daddy, he's so good, he's gonna kill you. And then that's exactly what happens in the next move. And Jeremiah says, see, I told you so. He killed you. You're so bad. And he said in this really mean tone. Isaac started to cry. And he's like, I know, but why did you have to say it like that? So then I asked Jeremiah, yeah, why did you say it like that? And he's like, because I wanted to get revenge. And I asked him, okay, well, what's wrong with revenge? And he's like, gets worse and worse. So like, one eye turns into two eyes, and four. And then eventually you got to take out the whole family and the whole group, and it goes on and on. It's that cycle of retaliation. And this is a sad history that gets repeated over and over again, produces tensions all over the world, not just in the Middle East, but in every family and in every marriage that breaks apart. And God says, no, you will not go down this downward spiral. You will limit the consequences. And you know what else is really interesting about this is this eye for an eye was not to be done by the individual, but by the governing authorities. So if you look back at Deuteronomy 19, where this principle comes from, the verse is actually talking about a courtroom situation. It's saying the judge should be fair and moderate in dishing out justice. But when it comes to individuals, okay, they're supposed to pursue a higher standard, not pursue your personal vendetta, okay? So as it says in Leviticus, so eye for an eye. It's not supposed to be for personal ethics. Leviticus, it says, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So in the Bible, there is this difference between individual or personal ethics and public or legal ethics. And that is really helpful for us to know, even as we think about issues of justice to this day. Okay, so now fast forward to from the Old Testament to Jesus' times, and they're in a turbulent world of Roman occupation without a governing authority that they could trust. So in regards to this whole eye for an eye principle given to the Jewish courtroom, the emperor-worshiping Roman government is not going to abide by that. So the Pharisees, they reason that this principle could be used to promote personal revenge, even though the original law in Deuteronomy was never meant to promote personal revenge. But at the same time, it is understandable because the Romans, they're like all wronging the Jewish people. Got a little excited there, drew some Romans, okay? So this whole issue of retaliation and the whole issue of like the right amount of retaliation, that's just in the air. And in light of all that context, what is Jesus saying through this section on the Sermon on the Mount? He is saying, do not respond to evil in kind. Do not respond to evil with another evil. The whole logic of, well, he did it first, that should not be our way of operating. And man, it is so tempting to respond in kind because the other person, they say some nasty things. So like, I'm gonna say some nasty things back. And if they're slander, I'm gonna slander them back. And if they're mean, I'll be mean back. So it is eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But Jesus is saying this is not how his disciples are to respond to wrongs. The heart of God, which is always a challenge for us, it is to be generous in the midst of wrong. But that does not mean that you're just some doormat who just passively takes it all in and lets it happen to you. You're not supposed to just be sheepishly taking it. You're not supposed to be a punching bag. No, what Jesus is saying is that there's something active that you're supposed to be doing in those situations. And what's amazing is that when we do that, we end up turning the table around. It reverses the dynamic, and he's teaching us whenever we face an obstacle in our situation, we have an opportunity to do this amazing reversal, this spiritual judo. Instead of getting stuck, we can ask, how can I advance the kingdom of God in this situation? Okay, so let's consider the first situation. The slap. Purpose of a slap. What's the purpose? Is it for pain? Not quite, right? It's humiliation. okay? And Walter Wink, a theologian who wrote at length about how a Christian is supposed to respond to evil, has kind of a funny interpretation. So he paid close attention to the fact that the first slap was on the right cheek, okay? How do you slap, if you're right-handed, how do you slap someone on the right cheek? Backhand, okay? So assuming that the aggressor is right-handed, it would be a backhanded slap. What's the purpose of that? It's just to totally humiliate, right? Because you get more leverage this way. Why would you backhand? Just to humiliate completely. But then you're supposed to what? You're supposed to offer him the left cheek? So now, like, in order to backhand, he has to, like, I don't know, like do this, or, you know, it's awkward, right? So anyway, this is like this interpretation. It's kind of like funny, all right? And you could, you know, think about this more, talk about it during lunch. But the point still stands. So imagine if someone, like a Roman soldier, is trying to humiliate another person by slapping him. What does he expect? He expects the humiliated person to cower and back down and be humiliated. But no, let's say this guy does something else. He refuses. He goes, hey, slap the other side as well. So how do you respond to that? Like, it's a refusal to cower. Suddenly, this person is above the whole humiliation game. Next scenario, courtroom scene where someone is suing someone and trying to take your tunic. So the tunic is the full body undergarment that you wore underneath your outer cloak. And the outer cloak is what kept you warm, okay? 2 layers. Indispensable, not just in Boston, but back then too. So much so that in the Old Testament law in Exodus 22, when the cloak was given as a pledge, the outer cloak had to be returned before sunset because it was used by the poor as a cover, sleeping cover. So it's considered inhumane to take someone's outer cloak. So this situation, someone is being really cruel. They're trying to sue someone for basically their underwear. And they're so poor that all they can take is the tunic. And Jesus is saying, what is he saying? He's saying, take off your cloak. Give it to him as well. Again, this is a very odd reversal because now the other person is in the position of like saying, I thank you, I guess. And they got to return the cloak before sunset. So you're now lending your cloak to the guy who's trying to sue you for your underwear. While everyone, you're kind of like, you don't have any clothes on. Everyone's looking at you, and they're like, oh man, that's messed up. And they're looking at this guy who has like all of that. So that's a situation. Next scene. Forces you to go 1 mile, okay? So a Roman soldier could force a people to carry something. And we see that in the Passion account, Simon of Cyrene, the Roman soldier, they forced him to carry the cross of Jesus. And I was always like, whoa, he just did it? Like, that's really heavy. Why would? But it's because they had that, they could do that. They oppressed the people around them and they could force them to do that. So 1 mile is the maximum distance that a Roman soldier can force someone to carry something. At the end of that mile, what do you think they would expect, right? What would the Roman soldier expect? They'd expect that person to just like, you know, throw it down, go home, maybe like spit or something like that. But then you reach that mile and you say, hey, I'll just carry this for you another mile. And I'm doing this, before that you made me, but this time I'm just doing it for you. And this places that soldier in a very, very odd position. So now this soldier has to like thank the person that he tried to oppress. Romans 12 says, to the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. What Jesus is saying is not that we become a punching bag, but to reverse the whole situation. It's to rise above the whole game. And he ends this section with verse 42. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. So in other words, he's saying, be generous. That's the heart of God, contrasted with the spirit of vengeance and retaliation. The whole eye for an eye thing. That's not a horrible thing. That comes from a heart of fairness, making sure everyone gets their fair consequence. But what is the heart of God behind that concession? You know, as a father, Sometimes I talk to my kids, and I might say, yeah, if your brother takes something from you, then take it back. Punches you, wants someone, punch him back once. And I did tell them that when they were when they were younger and stuff. But that would be a concession. Okay, that'd be a concession. My heart would be, I want them to learn to be generous toward one another, to rise above the whole petty tit for tat, eye for an eye thing. He punches you, offer him the other arm. See what he does. My heart would be don't be so exacting. I think in our relationships, much of the tension comes from this exacting attitude. Like when you work with people, like project groups, I don't know, people you work with, you want each person to carry their weight in the group. And if they don't, things start to get a little salty. Or when you share common items, you live in a house with other people. Common foods. Bought some boxes of cereal. You put it above the refrigerator. Special edition Lucky Charms, St. Patrick's Day, the green shamrock things, and people are eating it. Can you believe it? My $7 cereal, someone's eating that. You take the box into your room, label it, label the milk too, put your name on it. Or what about shared responsibilities or chores? I'm just gonna clean my dishes. Whose dishes are in the sink? I'm not cleaning. If I clean your dishes today, then that person better clean my dishes tomorrow. You've heard it said, a cereal for a cereal, a dish for a dish. But I tell you, be generous to each other. That's the heart of God. And into this tender spot, Jesus presses in even further in the next section. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. So verse 43, you shall love, let me see if my pen works, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Where is this from? Earlier we read Leviticus, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I'm the Lord. There's a difference there, right? It says the love your neighbor part, but not the hate your enemy part. So what's going on? I think the Pharisees, in trying to define neighbor, right, they said, oh, look, it says sons of your own people, okay? So it only applies to fellow Jews. So that means I can hate the non-Jews, the Gentiles. And this is another example of how the Pharisees, in trying to define the line, actually created more leeway and more loopholes for themselves. That's the heart of legalism. But then Jesus, he tells us, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And some of you thinking I don't really have enemies. I'm a nice guy. A lot of you, you're nice people, right? I don't have enemies. Well, often our enemies are not our real enemies. They're not like the Romans, but they're the people who sometimes feel like enemies to us. They're the people who are closest to us, that sometimes can seem harder to love than enemies. Man, if there's some Romans, I can love Romans, but man, the people I'm close to, they're the people who are hard to love. They're the people that we're argumentative with, that we want to fight. Or maybe we know we can't fight them, and so we just want to avoid. They're the people with which, when you talk about them to other people, some degree of, snarkiness or something comes out, and other people oh, you're talking about this guy, where did that come from? There's something there. So, when I describe, does someone jump out to you? Does a name pop out to you? Someone you get into tension with, that you often argue with, or sometimes you're I want to avoid that person. I don't know. Not going to look at him, but maybe you're sitting right next to them. It could be your roommate, your spouse, your family member. Well, what does it take to love them? I think it takes humility. When you get a slap in the face, what is it that gets hurt? Not just your face, it's something deeper. It's this pride, this ego. We don't actually get slapped in the face, but man, it sure feels like it when we get hurt by someone. We don't actually get sued for our tunic, but it does feel like that other person is really that petty. And when that person does that thing that is so insulting, it takes almost this supernatural humility to be insulted or hurt and to not retaliate. And ironically, you experience that the most with people that you're closest with. So That's your enemy, all right? Whatever, fill in the blank, right? And they go like, roar. And then so you want to retaliate. You want to like punch that monster, right? Because they deserve it. But what if instead you're generous? And you allow it to like hurt you, roar at you, slap you, sue you. What if sacrificial love is the only antidote to the monster becoming your friend again? Like, I show this to people who are close, and they're all like, wow, that ministered to be more than actually a message. Because that's what's happening all the time. But then, how do you do that? That moment when they first go, roar, right? That is so hard. As powerful as this is, we're like, this is so hard. How do you get that kind of humility? I think part of it comes from a recognition that the same sin in them is also in us. What's the motivation for someone to roar, to persecute us? What's the motivation for someone to slander or to hurt? Maybe part of it is a desire to like demonize those who seem better than us because the presence of someone better than us is threatening. Maybe they want to tear you down or tear everyone else down, bring you down so they can feel better about themselves. Maybe they've been hurt and they're taking it out on you. And then when I voice that, I'm like, now that is a motivation that I'm kind of familiar with. So then who's the enemy? It's me. That's who I can see myself doing that. Like, do you see how we can be that same monster to the people around you? Like the same sin, it runs through our own hearts. I think we could relate with these evil motives because we're guilty of the same sins. So isn't it good news that he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good and sends rain on the just and on the unjust? Because we're all those things. We're both. Thank God that he loves all of us, even though we all take turns being that monster. Verse 46, for if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? He's saying, if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Doesn't everybody do that? It's not like you should get a medal for it. And I think this is a challenge to the followers of Christ. Don't spiritualize what everyone does naturally. Like love for my kids, love for family, that's natural. Don't spiritualize it by saying, that's who I'm going to love. That's who I'm called to love. I'm going to minister to my family, my kids. That's my calling in life. I'm going to bake cookies for my family, cook them steak, provide for my kids. And Jesus is saying, don't tax collectors do the same? Even like terrorists, they love their kids. Even ducks take care of their kids. Like our Christian calling should be something higher than what animals do naturally. And so in verse 47, he's like, what more are you doing? And that's a very piercing question to ask. So there's this expectation for the Christian that you're supposed to be doing more than what other people do. When it comes to true, divinely imitated, sacrificial, powerful love, I think God's love, it has a higher standard. And we see that. Next verse. You therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Therefore, wraps up this whole section. This is the final, powerful, concluding charge. And we feel intimidated by this charge because, again, we think of this as like letter of the law command. So it's on your to-do list, right? And you're like, oh no, how can I possibly achieve that? How can I possibly check off that box? But of course, the heart of God in saying this is not so that we can make it into a checkbox. It's the Father's heart that says, imitate me, be like me. Don't aim to be bad, but be good like me. Be loving like me. Now, having said that, there is a sense in which this command is not as intimidating as it sounds, because I know you hear perfect and you're like, oh no. The connotation of the word perfect is not some kind of philosophical idea of perfection, but more of a complete or total. The one other time that Jesus used this word was when he confronted the rich young ruler. He said to him, you're still lacking one thing. if you would be perfect, sell all you have and come follow me. So he's not talking about moral perfection, but he's talking about following him completely, without reserve. What's the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. It's to love God perfectly and completely. And we're to give ourselves to that effort. Like, of course we would, because that's what love aims for. Like, what's the alternative? To aim for something lower? To love your God with half your heart? No, so to be like Jesus, to be like God, of course this is something we should pursue on earth, never to arrive at. So Apostle Paul, he said in Philippians, not that I have already obtained this or am already perfect, but I press on to make it my own because Christ Jesus has made me his own. So I press on, I strain forward, not because I'm trying to fulfill some requirement of the law, but because of what Christ has done for me. He has made me his own. How did he accomplish that? By living out what he preached. Jesus said, love your enemies. Be generous toward them. When one strikes you on one cheek, do not retaliate. Offer him the other voluntarily. And he did that. And more, he offered his life for us on the cross. So that when Jesus said, love your enemies, that is exactly what he did. End with this. But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more now that we are reconciled, shall we be saved by his life. Who are the enemies? We were the enemies that rejected God. But we have been loved with an unfathomable, generous love. So because of the amazing love we've received, we can stop our eye for an eye exacting ways. We can afford to rise above the petty squabbles that insist on getting your due. Because God sent sunshine on the evil and on the good. Because God has loved the enemy. And God wants us to be like him in our interactions with each other. And the good news is that when we fail, we can remember that while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God. And so what does that mean? That means we can repent. We can turn back to God. So I want to give you a moment to think, write, pray, respond to this. I have some questions for you guys to this message. And talk through this. You know, the eye for an eye. So think about that. Like, how generous versus exacting are you? And maybe you need to take some time to confess your exacting or petty attitudes, or oftentimes it comes from like our preferences. What prevents you from being generous like God? Or take some time to, confess. Wow, I really am this petty. I am so small-hearted. I'm so not generous. Next question, who's your neighbor? You know, maybe there's ways in which you're like the Pharisees, this heart of legalism. You're figuring out leeways or loopholes to try to define who is your neighbor and who you're supposed to love and not love in order to make your life easier. So maybe you need to pray to see more people as your neighbor, that people you've been avoiding, or maybe you're steeling your heart against. And lastly, pray for higher love. For some of you, I think you just need a minute thinking about like, who's the person that you're having a hard time loving? That quote-unquote enemy, the person that you want to argue with or avoid. And we need to follow Jesus' advice and just pray for that person right now. And I mean, it does hurt, right? It hurts to absorb that and take that. And I don't know, for me, it feels like getting stabbed in the heart, right? Just kind of like wrenching it back and forth. And man, when my pride is finally like flopping down on the floor, dying a painful death, the other person can finally go, oh, okay, now you're much more lovable, now that that has died. So think about it, all right? And if it's hard, think about Jesus, who had that higher love for us, and take some time killing that little pride monster that wants to control us. Think about Jesus and how you can be like him and pray that, okay? So give you guys a few minutes to just think, write, pray. We're going to sing this song in about 3 minutes or so. So give you guys time and space to do that.